Commemorating 4 decades. Commemorating 4 decades of the Indian state's genocide of the Sikh nation. We're here as a community seeking acknowledgement. That acknowledgement is the first step to accountability, which is a step towards justice. But before I begin, I have to start by recognizing that we're at a moment of grim contradiction. The safety to demand this acknowledgement in the Parliament of Canada, in this nation state that is now more Sikh than all of India by percentage, this is afforded to us because policies of ethnic cleansing, of genocide, of displacement, of settler colonialism, of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations of this land. Today, my journey to be here with you, to share about this story on the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe, Algonquin Nation, means that I've arrived here using an economic system that's inextricably tied to the ongoing genocides of other stateless nations around the world. So it's with a very heavy heart. But all I can offer to these people with whom I see so much in common with the Sikh nation is just these meager acknowledgements. But acknowledgement means a lot. My mom, she was 15 years old. She was 15 years old when she received the news of the assassination of Indira Gandhi. Earlier that year, the Indian Prime Minister had ordered the Indian Army to assault the holiest Sikh Gurdwara and dozens of others. She launched an invasion to crush a peaceful political movement. Contrary to the propaganda, it was not advocating for a succession of the Sikh state. In the process, thousands were massacred, thousands of innocent civilians, and our holy texts, religious artifacts, handwritten scriptures were burnt and looted. So receiving the news of Indira Gandhi's assassination to my mom felt like a small moment of relief. Even if it was extrajudicial, she felt that justice had been done. But that sense of relief was shattered the very next morning when a brick came flying through her living room window while their family was having breakfast, and a mob outside had gathered, screaming, "Sikhs are the traitors of this nation," and blood for blood. The mob dispersed. My family called the police multiple times, but no one answered. And my mom sat there by the phone waiting for someone to call back. It wasn't the police who called. There were voices who recognized my mom by her voice, and they threatened to rape, to mutilate, and butcher every member of my family. Across the country, mobs like these were organized, orchestrated, planned meticulously by politicians, by police, by actors and celebrities. Voter rolls were used to identify where Sikhs lived. Transportation was organized to bus in mobs. They were armed systematically. Lawyers and researchers now argue that this was all planned and it wasn't just an organic reaction to the assassination of Indira Gandhi. It had all been planned out for political gain. So the next day, a much larger mob showed up to my parents' home. They torched the car, torched the scooter, cut off the electricity, cut off the water. But then the mob dispersed. Again, my family called for the police, but no one showed up. Later that night, the mob returned for a third and final time. This time they were armed with machetes, they were armed with iron rods, they were armed with torches. They breached the front gate. They made their way into the living room. A small hallway separated that living room to the back of the house. My mom, the eldest sibling, with my grandfather, rushed to barricade the door, while her younger siblings and my grandmother made their way escaping through the back. My mom can distinctly recall the voices, those same voices that she heard on the phone, calling to murder them as they came face to face with their would-be murderers. But somehow she summoned superhuman strength, slammed the door shut, buying her family, herself, just enough time to run back, escape over a 6-foot wall that was in their backyard. The 5 members of my family dispersed in all different directions. My neighbors, they grabbed my grandma and my mom, and for hours they were hidden in their kitchen cellar, not knowing who had survived and who had died. Eventually, my family was reunited after midnight. Thankfully, no one was injured or killed. And they slept that night at a neighbor's, watching the first home that they ever owned in the nation-state of India smolder overnight. But you see, their relatives in other parts of India, they weren't so lucky. My grandfather's nephews, their names, Harjinder, Bhupinder, and Khalsa Singh, aged 30, 25, and 20. They were doused with kerosene and torched in front of their widowed mother, who had raised them through difficult circumstances. After receiving this news, my grandfather, he told my mom, "Make something of yourself, because this country no longer wants us." If you had told 7-year-old me that my mom moved to America for me to have a better chance at living a more free Sikh life, I would have been really confused. You see, I was 7 years old when 9/11 happened. To many Americans, the guy who claimed responsibility for these acts of terror, he looked just like us with a turban and a beard and brown skin. 4 days after the attacks, the very first person to be killed in an act of hate was a Sikh man gunned down at his gas station. And that very week, the only friend I had in my neighborhood, her mom stopped letting her play with me because she thought we hated America. Every month I heard stories about kids having their turbans set on fire in school, gurdwaras being targeted with graffiti or arson, or uncles being shot, stabbed, killed. At that age, I had never heard of 1984. I didn't know what it was. But what I did know was that wearing your turban in your country made you a target. And so every single day I'd ask myself, why? Why do I tie this thing on my head? Ironically, it was getting told all the time, go back to your country, go back to where you come from, on a regular basis. That actually got me going back to India, and that's where I learned to love the parts of me that America did not yet understand. I eventually discovered that my turban, it was a challenge from my ancestors, a challenge to stand up for who I am and what I believe in. And those are values that are as American, as Canadian, as they are Sikh. You see, if we are prepared to keep our turban in the face of adversity, then we're prepared to face any challenge. I rose to the challenge using my video camera. I was 13 years old when I started making documentary films. I wanted to uplift the Sikh American experience, so someone else besides Osama bin Laden that had a turban and beard, to my neighbors, to my peers. And what I realized when I shared my films, that it wasn't just Sikh Americans who were being uplifted. There were people from all different communities who were empowered by my films. I would hear from Jewish kids, from Muslim kids, from Hindu kids, that they felt emboldened and empowered to wear their yarmulkes, to wear their hijabs, to not go to school with their weird smelling food and feel ashamed of it because it was strange in the eyes of the majority in America. They felt proud to be themselves. And that's when I realized the work that I was doing, I was illuminating a light for my own community, but that was uplifting others. And as Sikhs, we pray for this. It's called Sarbat da Pala, the upliftment of all of mankind. So after graduating from college, I joined Vice News. I began working as a journalist full-time. My passion was to tell stories about South Asia for a North American audience. But as I learned more about the politics of India, I realized there was actually a lot in common between the world's largest democracy and the world's oldest. And with those commonalities come similarities in the challenges people face. And when I saw that people in India were facing the same challenges that I faced growing up, I wanted to speak up for them. In 2020, I went to India to report on how Muslims were afraid about Hindu nationalist policies that would strip them of their citizenship and have them thrown in detention camps. Our reporting won several journalism awards in America. It was even quoted by the UN Undersecretary General for the Prevention of Genocide. But 2 years after I published that film, I got on a plane to New Delhi to visit my grandma, who's currently battling cancer after she had barely survived COVID. And when I reached immigration, I was turned around, sat back on the very plane that I came on, and sent back to the United States with no explanation whatsoever. When I got back, I had to sue the Indian government in the New Delhi High Court to find out why I had been turned away. Why did I get turned away from this land that I loved so much as a child? What I found out was that I had been accused of creating propaganda against the state, that my film was allegedly this propaganda that showed India in its secular credentials in a negative light. Getting blacklisted, it caused me to self-censor. I wanted more than anything to be able to go home and visit my grandparents. I wanted more than anything to be able to go back to that land where I called home. For my children one day to be able to see that land and to build that connection that I had the chance to as a child. I wanted to go back to that way India made me feel as a kid. But then I realized, Sikhs in the diaspora, we aren't just put on blacklists. We're also put on hit lists. I'd never heard of Hardeep Singh Nijjar until he was assassinated. Even after he was killed, there was parts of me that felt resigned to just accepting us as something that just happens. But there were many survivors of 1984, like my mom, who were saying, this isn't normal, this doesn't just happen. And yet, even me, I wanted to write her off as a conspiracy theorist. It took me 4 months after his death to finally show up to Surrey, to finally start asking questions. And I interviewed a man who chased his assassins barefoot through a park as they got into their getaway vehicle. And after he told me his account of what he witnessed that day, absolutely harrowing, he asked me one question, and that one question has haunted me for the better part of a year. His question to me was, why did it take you so long to show up? Immediately, I reached for an excuse. I actually had a few that were legitimate. On one hand, I was about to be laid off. My company that I had been a part of for 7 years was going bankrupt, and I couldn't get the funding to pursue this story. On the other hand, I was swamped with legal paperwork for my blacklisting case in India. It was deeply emotional. But I knew, deep down, these were excuses. The truth is it wasn't until September 18th, 2023, when Justin Trudeau went on the floor of Parliament and he acknowledged what was going on. And he acknowledged that India could be behind this assassination, that I felt I was free enough and safe enough to move ahead with what was my duty as a journalist and my right as an American and as a Sikh to be able to speak my mind freely. That's when I realized this is how powerful the policies of transnational repression and decades of disinformation truly are. You see, we as Sikhs have been painted as the villains of our own genocide for so long. We come to stop believing our own stories, and we stop telling them ourselves. It means even someone like me, I wouldn't even believe my mom right away. This is why acknowledgement is so important. Canada's investigation into its public acknowledgement of transnational repression, it freed me, the Emmy-winning, award-winning journalist who was American-born, who had worked at CNN, MSNBC, Vice News for 8 years. Even someone with all of my privilege, I felt like I couldn't speak. And I share this experience with you all because I want to ask you to imagine, what does it feel like for the survivors of 1984, for 40 years to not have this genocide acknowledged? How must that weight feel to them? Our survivors, they live in a world where their stories are told, but never by them. Their narratives are regularly dismissed. They are burdened to prove it every single time. So passing a resolution to recognize the Sikh genocide, it's going to validate the experience that so many of us have had to live through for so many decades. And that acknowledgement, it's the first step to accountability. And accountability is that next step towards justice. So I ask you for your solidarity today to pass this resolution recognizing the genocide. It's more than just lip service. It means everything to us. Thank you. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Thank you, Angad Singh, for those powerful words and for sharing the story of your mother who's a survivor.